When Holland, Michigan was settled in the middle of the 19th century, a band of Dutch colonists began clearing the trees that surrounded a pristine inland lake. The Native Americans who preceded them called the lake Macatawa, which means black water.
So often we think of Holland as being a place that is next to Lake Michigan. But if you really look at the communities and the jurisdictions that border water in the greater Holland area, we have no Lake Michigan waterfront. But we do have Lake Mac waterfront.
As the decades passed and the community grew and prospered, the lake provided a hospitable harbor for commerce and transportation.
The lake and the quality of life that is connected with the river, Lake Mac, Lake Michigan is a huge component, I think, of our community's personality, of what we are.
It is the heart of the Macatawa Watershed. It is the heart of Holland, Michigan.
It became a popular playground for recreation, fishing, and tourism, teeming with activity on the long, languid days of summer. But over time, the abundant forests were harvested, the thriving farmsteads, industrial development, and expanding neighborhoods supplanted the natural wetlands. And over the last several decades, the lake has begun to become very dirty, very nutrient-rich, what we call hyperneutrophic, and is now not the environment that it once was.
Over time, you just basically tolerated the murkiness, the algae, the fact that it was a little dirtier.
This is a legacy thing. People have been talking for years about wanting Lake Mac to be even better than it is. And so we talk and talk and talk, and when the opportunity comes up to go for it, you gotta jump on board.
We can do many things that will make this better. We know what we need to do, and now all we need to do is find both the will and the funding to get it done.
Following the Ice Age, Lake Macatawa took on its character and shape, developing from a river channel to a more substantial drowned river mouth lake. It's the exit point of the Macatawa River, and it's where the water spreads out and at one point in time ran through a much more diverse wetland environment where it filtered the waters before it reached Lake Michigan. It stretched from the wooded wetlands area near what is today the northern edge of downtown Holland, all the way to the coastal dunes of Lake Michigan, almost 5 miles to the west.
In the old days, before colonization, the lakes were intermittent. They would, periodically they would fill up, and then in the spring when it rained, they would overflow into Lake Michigan, and then they would dam up again with the sand. And that's the way the colonists found it when they arrived around 1849. You have to remember where the Dutch settlers came from. They were coming from the Netherlands, and they were fleeing high population pressure. They were trying to get away from people. They had their own religious beliefs, and they wanted to be on their own. And they wanted a place that could sustain a colony.
Reverend Van Raalte, who was the leader of this group of seceders from the State Church of the Netherlands who settled this area, chose this area because of the lake and its outlet to Lake Michigan. He came from a country where rivers were the highways, and he knew the importance of waterways when he came here. He was actually intending to take his group to southern Wisconsin, to the Fond du Lac area by Lake Winnebago, but he met Judge John Kellogg of Allegan, who was well familiar with this area, and Kellogg said, "Come with me and I'll show you an area between the Kalamazoo River and the Grand River which had not been settled by whites, which is the Black River watershed." So he brought Van Raalte here in early January of 1847. He walked through the snow on snowshoes with an Indian guide, and he walked the area. And he became convinced that this was an ideal place to settle his Dutch colony.
And then the settlers arrived that spring and the snow melted and they discovered they were standing in a swamp.
In the first years, it was very difficult, yeah. They were opening up virgin land.
They had to do what they'd done in the Netherlands for many years. They industriously drained the swamp that they found. They also cleared the land. They cut down every tree they could find.
The area was entirely wooded, densely wooded. Settlers talked about getting lost, walking from one cabin to their neighbor's cabin.
There's wonderful stories about the trees being so thickly settled that a man could not swing an axe between two trees. They'd swing backwards and hit the tree behind you. So they had to use saws to get the first trees out till they could clear a path. They did manage to drain something like 85% of the wetlands eventually. And that turned into good land on which to build and to farm. And the lake was more or less untouched. The settlers, of course, needed the transportation. It was so thickly wooded that they needed to actually be able to get in and out of the lake, so they dug a channel, and that allows the lake to continuously drain into Lake Michigan. The lake itself has not changed shape in 150 years. We have the early plat records of where the lake was, and it overlays almost identically to the current shape of the lake, which means the lake has probably retained this shape for the last 2,000–3,000 years. It hasn't changed significantly. The water quality has changed, however. Lake Macatawa is eutrophic, and that means that we have too many nutrients in the lake, and that puts the ecological cycle out of balance. The one that's in excess here is phosphorus, and those particles come attached to sediment. So phosphorus comes with the dirt. If you have too many nutrients, the algae will go wild, they'll bloom, they'll have a blockage of the light that gets through to the bottom, so the plants on the bottom die. With those lake plants gone, the fish populations will change. So this ecological balance has been upset by putting too many nutrients into the lake. What we've changed about the landscape that has affected hydrology in this area is that we have removed the natural barrier for that rainwater getting back into Lake Michigan.
We've built these city centers with pavement and rooftops in our subdivisions, and we're just making water move faster. And the faster the water moves, the more erosion we have. We have no wetlands now. We have nothing to stop this water. It's carrying sediment, and the phosphorus is bound to the sediment and goes to our Lake Macatawa.
One of the symptoms of the sediment erosion that we have in the lake is that we constantly have to dredge that shipping channel. And some parts are dredged every year, some parts need dredging every 5 to 10 years, but that is tangible evidence. I don't know how much more tangible evidence you could get of the problems that we have going on in the upper watershed.
We've cut down the trees, we've cut down the canopy, we have tilled the fields, and we've often straightened the channels so that they don't have to meander. We can be much more efficient, and that means the channels flood. This is one of the flashiest watersheds I know. In an inch rain, we can have the water levels rise 8 feet in a couple of hours.
This watershed is highly affected by weather patterns. The erosion that happens, the sediment that's delivered, is based on rainfall intensity and when it happens and how often it happens.
Picture yourself in the southern part of the watershed. It's Fillmore Township, and there are a lot of farm fields. When it rains, raindrops actually hit the soil. So let's say it's before the crops have been planted. Raindrops are hitting the soil, and if it's a big rainstorm, they're hitting the soil with a lot of impact. And they're carrying soil and all the nutrients that are attached to those soil particles down a slope to the nearest stream.
When you look at this soil here, this is Capac loam. It's heavy. The normal person would call it clay. And so during a rain event, if you drive around the watershed, you can see where the fragile soil is.
When you're driving around in a rainstorm and you're driving over these ditches and these creeks in the South Branch, if you look over the roadway, you'll see that it looks like chocolate milk. And rivers and streams aren't supposed to look like that, but that's the symptom of what's really wrong with the watershed, is that we're having all of this surface water runoff and sediment erosion.
The time it takes from when it falls on a farmer's field to it gets out the Lake Mac is measured typically in days or weeks. It doesn't take very long for that water to pass through. Originally, it would have taken months to years.
So we're just pumping Lake Macatawa full of these sediments, nutrients.
Those mud sediments are very fluid, they're easily resuspended, and they kick up the phosphorus and sediment in the lake, causes more light to be extinguished. There's not enough light getting through the water column because it's so dirty. And then the underwater vegetation can't grow because they don't have enough light to photosynthesize. That vegetation is critical habitat for the fish and the invertebrates. And so once you have too much sediment, too much phosphorus, you get more algae instead of the vegetation underneath, and you lose the habitat for the fisheries, for the wildlife.
When the algae dies, it'll sink to the bottom of the lake and it'll use up dissolved oxygen. And that also leads to fish kills and fish populations changing.
There is some flow in Lake Macatawa, so eventually that water is making it to Lake Michigan. And we have aerial pictures of Lake Macatawa and the flow going into Lake Michigan, and you can see distinctly the plume, the very dark chocolate brown plume coming out of Lake Macatawa that's just filling the nearshore areas of Lake Michigan with the sediment and the nutrients, and that's continually happening during every rainstorm.
What people don't realize is that in 365 days of the year, there are only about 5 or 6 days that carry 99% of the sediment. If we were just ban that rainstorm 6 days a year, we'd be fine. There'd be no water quality issues. We'd have other issues with not enough water. But most of the water is coming on 3 or 4 big flood events that carry all the sediment with it. And that we can't change. We won't be able to change the seasonality of the rain or how heavy it comes when it comes, but we can change what happens to it when the rain hits the ground.
If the water is cleaner, then we can do more with it. We can recreate in it, wildlife benefits from it, economic benefits arrive from it. If we have cleaner water, property values will go up. If we have cleaner water, there'll be more recreation opportunities, increased tourism. All that we do in this community depends on us having good, clean water.
This community has been talking about the issue of trying to clean up Lake Macatawa for a long time. The fact that it's come up again and again, time and time, about being a top 3, top 5 community priority. Eventually, it gets to a point where you say, we gotta figure this thing out.
The good news is that it is fixable. Most of our problems are going to be solved by getting rid of dirt. The very first thing we recognized when studying the lake was that if we could remove the sediment, then we would be removing most of the phosphorus.
Lakes are very resilient systems. If you stop the abuse, they tend to recover relatively quickly. So it's sort of like stopping smoking. If you do that immediately, you will see a benefit in terms of your lung capacity recovery. And it's the same thing with lakes. If you stop the pollution or reduce the pollution, the lakes have this innate ability to recover, and that's what we want to set themselves up to allow them to recover. We want to give them assistance to help them in their own recovery.
I think that we've been working over many years to improve the conditions of the lake. I think the breakthrough that I see in the efforts going on right now is that we're kind of stepping back and looking at it as a whole system.
It's not just the lake, it's not just the watershed or the upland area or one particular subbasin. You really need to attack the problem in an integrated fashion.
We've been through, a long process and history of various projects and planning, and we just had a management plan updated and approved, so we've got a really good set of tools to guide what needs to be done in the watershed based on both modeling and on scientific research.
We now know where our challenges come from, and we know how to address them. Now it's a matter of will to do so.
So what we want to do is put in practices and develop practices that are very good for retaining sediment upstream. We want to clean up the microbial contaminations in the lake so that we don't have, so we can enter the water safely.
You need to control the external sources of the pollutants into the lake before you tackle the lake. It doesn't make any sense to clean up the lake when new sources continue to come in. Well, you know, at best you're buying a few years, at worst you're just wasting money.
In order to clean up the watershed, it'll take a significant multifaceted approach. There's no one thing that can be done that will address all the concerns and problems that are facing the watershed. But one of the main areas that we can address is the wetlands that were lost in the original settlement of the Holland Zeeland area.
The plan that's being put in place now for widespread wetland restoration in the critical areas of the watershed is probably the most important thing that can happen now. These very important wetland restoration sites that we're going to have in critical areas of the watershed are hugely important for holding that water back, reducing flooding, providing habitat, and really reducing the amount of nutrients. Phosphorus is the big one in Lake Macatawa.
The sediment and phosphorus, instead of flowing downstream, will be diverted into these wetland restoration areas. The sediment will filter out, settle out naturally. The sediment is like glue. The phosphorus sticks to it. So if you can settle out the sediment, you're going to settle out a lot of the phosphorus as well, and then keep it in that wetland rather than getting it out there.
Macatawa Greenway and ODC have purchased various properties or acquired easements to both protect the land and eventually connect it together. Our motto